Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we continue reading Emerson's journal collection number 26, which dates from 1835, and we are up to July 27th of that year. Emerson is 32 years old as of May of this year. And with that said, I will go ahead and start. We begin July 27th. One of those crystal days which are neither hot nor cold. Mrs. R. cited a well-known character to show that trick and pretension impose on nobody, but that my friend is reverenced for his liberality. Everybody leads 2 or 3 lives, has 2 or 3 consciousnesses, which he nimbly alternates. Here am I daily lending my voice, and that with heat often, to opinions and practices opposite to my own. Here is M.E. always fighting in conversation against the very principles which have governed and govern her. Very good remarks saw I in the very good Record of a School concerning unity reproduced by the mind out of severed parts. Yes, all men have thoughts, images, facts by thousands and thousands, but only one of many can crystallize these into a symmetrical one by means of the nucleus of an idea. Humphrey Haywood showed me his fine toy cart, which his father made for him. I see nothing of the farmer but his plain dealing and hard work, yet there are finer parts which, but for this child, would remain latent, his love and the taste which makes a fanciful child's wagon for its manifestation. A good example of that prosopopoeia I wrote of is Thomson's "Come to nurse our bantling in the cradle of liberty." Yet I do not know whether that is right. Methinks he has grown so great that if we should rock him in Faneuil Hall, his feet would dangle out the door. One of the best examples of this sort is Burke's Shearing the Wolf. Here is an insertion from the editor. Here follow many pages of extracts from Ogre's True Messiah, or the Old and New Testaments examined according to the principles of the language of nature. A few of these are given. Quote, "People suppose that when God produced our visible world, the choice that he made of forms and colors for animals, plants, and minerals was entirely arbitrary on his part. This is false. Man may sometimes act from whim. God never can. The visible creation then cannot, must not, if we may use such an expression, be anything but the exterior circumference of the invisible and metaphysical world, and material objects are necessarily kind of a scoria of the substantial thoughts of the Creator. For God to create is only to show. The universe in its minutest details existed for God as really before the creation as after it, because it existed in him substantially, as when the statue exists in the block of marble from which the sculptor extracts it. Quote, "By the creation, we only have been enabled to perceive a portion of the infinite riches eternally buried in the divine essence. The perfect especially must have always thus existed in God. The imperfect alone can have received a kind of creation by means of man, a free agent, though under the influence of a providence which never loses sight of him." Quote, "Neither the form nor the color of any object in nature can have been chosen without a reason. Everything that we see, touch, smell, everything from the sun to a grain of sand, has flowed forth by a supreme reason from that world where all is spirit and life. No fiber in the animal, no blade of grass in the vegetable, no form of crystallization in inanimate matter, is without its clear and well-determined correspondence in the moral and metaphysical world. And if this is true of colors and forms, it must, by a still stronger reason, be true of instincts and animals, and the far more astonishing faculties of man. Consequently, the most imperceptible thoughts and affections which we imagine we have conceived by our own power, the compositions which we consider our own philosophy and literature, the inventions which we believe we have made in the arts and sciences, the monuments that we think we are erecting, the customs that we fancy we establish in the things which men consider great, as in the most insignificant transaction of civil and animal life. All this existed before us. All this is simply given to us, and given with a supreme reason according to our different wants. An infinitely little degree of consent to receive, which forms our moral liberty, is the only thing that we have for our own. And indeed, but for all these emblems of life which creation offers, there would be no appreciable moral idea or moral sentiment, no possible means, we fear not to say it, for God to communicate a thought and affection to his creature, any more than for one feeling creature to communicate it to another. Quote, "Had there been no father, could you know anything of tenderness? Had there never been a generous man, could you know what is generosity? Love, maladies, defilements, the persecutions show what is atrocity, etc., etc. The necessity of indicating moral distinctions alone explains monstrosities and disgusting images unworthy of the Creator, which nature offers to the eye of degraded man. The abyss of our being cannot be revealed but by the appreciable phenomena of life." Quote, "Man and the serpent form the right angle. Other animals fill the whole quadrant, and any other kind of beings is geometrically impossible." Quote, "Jehovah addresses himself to all his intelligent creation, and each being finds in his words what is appropriate to himself. The pure spirits who act on the human race must necessarily be always in advance of it in knowledge of the oracles of the Most High, the perfect accomplishment of which oracles they concur to produce, spite of the united efforts of all degraded spirits," etc. Every man must live upon a principle and move according to its will, as in the vehicular state every soul rides upon its ray. I have seen the adoption of a principle transform a proser into an orator. Every transgression that it makes of routine makes man's being something worth. Humility is a great time saver. The whole business must wait whenever each individual of the company has some personal recollection, some apology or explanation to make. All sit impatiently deferring till his impertinent vanity is adjusted, and then go on. I, who know the supreme folly of the thing, can collect instances not only from last night's conversation, but from my own sayings 2 nights ago at Dr. Willard's. July 30th. It is affecting to see the old man's, Thaddeus Blood's, memory taxed for facts occurring 60 years ago at Concord Fight. Quote, "It is hard to bring them up," he says. "The truth will never be known." The Dr. Ripley, like a keen hunter unrelenting, follows him up and down, barricading him with questions, yet cares little for the facts the man can tell, but much for the confirmation of the printed history. Quote, leave me to repose." Every principle is an eye to see with. Facts in thousands of the most interesting character are slipping by me every day unobserved, for I see not their bearing, I see not their connection. I see not what they prove. By and by I shall mourn in ashes their irreparable loss. No distinction in principle can be broader than that taken by the abolitionist against Everett. Everett said that in case of a servile war, though a man of peace, he would buckle on his knapsack to defend the planter. The philanthropist who was here in the morning says that he is a man of peace, but if forced to fight on either side, he should fight for the slave against his tyrant. I know nothing of the source of my being, that I will not soil my nest. I know much of it after a high negative way, but nothing after the understanding. God himself contradicts through me and all his creatures the miserable babble of Neeland and his crew. But if they set me to affirm in propositions his character and providence, as I would describe a mountain or an Indian, I am dumb. Oft I have doubted his person, never that truth is divine. You affirm that the moral development contains all the intellectual, and that Jesus was the perfect man. I bow in reverence unfeigned before that benign man. I know more, hope more, am more, because he has lived. But if you tell me that in your opinion he has fulfilled all the conditions of man's existence, carried out the utmost, at least by implication, all man's powers, I suspend my assent. I do not see in him cheerfulness. I do not see in him the love of natural science. I see in him no kindness for art. I see in him nothing of Socrates, of Laplace, of Shakespeare. The perfect man should remind us of all great men. Do you ask me if I would rather resemble Jesus than any other man? If I should say yes, I should suspect myself of superstition. Ages hence, books that cannot now be written may be possible. For instance, a cumulative moral and intellectual science. If I would know something of the elements and process of the moral sublime, where shall I now seek the analysis? If I would know the elementary distinctions of spiritual and intellectual, where shall I inquire? A sentence showing a tendency is all that a century contributes to psychology. Where shall I find the results of phrenology, of animal magnetism, of ecstasy? By and by, books of condensed wisdom may be writ by the concentrated lights of thousands of centuries, which shall cast Bacon and Aristotle into gloom. As the American Encyclopedia said of astronomy, quote, "How many centuries of observation were necessary to make the motion of the earth suspected?" End quote. July 31st. Every day's doubt is whether to seek for ideas or to collect facts. For all successful study is the marriage of thoughts and things, a continual reaction of the thought classifying the facts, and facts suggesting the thought. When shall I be tired of reading? When the moon is tired of waxing and waning, when the sea is tired of ebbing and flowing, when the grass is weary of growing, when the planets are tired of going. The act of duty that might have been omitted, but that was inserted in a past day, pleases in remembering the contingency with a better satisfaction than that which we see the mail stage roll off in its cloud of dust, if, breathless with haste, we have arrived just in time to get our letter in. I wrote yesterday that these orators of a principle owed everything to it, and our good friend Samuel J. may instruct us in many things. He goes everywhere and sees the leaders of society everywhere, his cause being his ticket of admission, and talks on his topic with no intelligent person who does not furnish some new light, some unturned side, some happy expression, or strike off some false view or expression of the philanthropist. In this way his views are enlarged and cleared, and he is always attaining to the best expressions. As when he said the question between the colonization and the abolition men was, quote, "whether you should remove them, the Negroes, from the prejudice, or the prejudice from them." End quote. It is, my God, an antidote to every fear, the conviction twice recently forced on me, that men reverence virtue never by the appearance, but accurately according to its weight. Nothing but an ounce will balance an ounce. Thus alone is the will strong. Thus he whose right it is to reign shall reign. Spit at consequences. Launch boldly forth into the pure element, and that which you think will down you shall buoy you up. And it says from the editor, here follows the last part of the passage on the stars in the first page of Nature. Men believe that some of their fellows are more happily constituted than themselves after the pattern of themselves. They have in fortunate hours had the eye opened, whereby the world was newly seen, as if then first seen, and which seemed to say that all prior life, however loud and pretending, was but death or sleep. They believe that some men add to this eye a tongue to tell their vision, and a certain degree of control over these faculties, that the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, and they wish such men to take the chronicle of their parish or their age, and in the auspicious hour let the facts pass through their mind, and see if they will not take the form of picture and song. When I cast my look inward, and look upon God as mine, I may well defy the future, and looking up all the rough weather ahead as exercises to try the faith of the combatants, I may merrily predict a victory. The reason has her victories. $15,000 were subscribed in a very short time in New York by these abolitionists, 2,000 at one meeting in Boston, and 5,000 at another, and forthwith paid. So put that against the burning convent and the Julian Hall. My two facts referred to on the last page were the bountiful E.R. and the Christian Sam May, who both pass for that they are in things to praise and things to blame. Quote, "For Christ made no cathedrals, nay, with him was no cardinals." Quote, Chaucer. Once in a while we meet with poetry, which is also music, quote, "high and passionate thoughts to their own music chanted." The following lines of John Barber, 1365, remind me of the music I heard lately. This was in the month of May, when birds singing in ilk spray may lend their notes with seemly sound, for softness of the sweet sea-zone. And leaves of the branch spread, and bloomous bright beside them bred, and fields are strovet with flowers, well sour and of sere colours. Me it pleases well to skip the minuter designation of the plants, and to slight also the chronicles of kings, so that I can learn somewhat of the history of wit in this world of men, to know what have been the entertainments of the human spirit from age to age, what are the best things that it hath said, and who and what they were who said them. Yet the beauty that drew us to one another pursued, as botany, medicine, history, of poetry, and the like, is presently lost sight of in the details of the study itself, and none the less poetical than the herbalist, the doctor, the critic. A system grinder hates the truth. To make a step into the world of thought is given but to few men. To make a second step beyond his first, only one in a country can do. But to carry the thought out to 3 steps marks a great teacher. Aladdin's palace, with its one unfinished window, which all the gems in the royal treasury cannot finish in the style of the meanest of the profusion of jeweled windows that were built by the genie in a night, is but too true a picture of the efforts of talent to add a scene to Shakespeare's play or a verse to Shakespeare's songs. August 1st. A sparrow or a deer knows much more of nature's secret than a man, but is less able to utter them, and those men who know the most can say the least. Jacob Boehme is the best helper to a theory of Isaiah and Jeremiah. You are so sure he was in earnest, and could you get into his point of view, the world would be what he describes. He is all imagination. Quote, "Aurora, i.e., the dayspring or dawning of the day in the Orient, or morning redness in the rising of the sun, i.e., the root or mother of philosophy, astrology, and theology from the true ground, etc., etc., by J. Boehme, written in Görlitz, in Germany, A.D. 1612, Aetatis Suae 37, London, 1656. Quote, "O world, where is thy humility? Where is thy angelical love? At the very instant when the mouth says, God save thee, then if the heart were seen, it might be said, Beware, look to thyself, for it bids the devil take thee." Boehme. Quote, "O thou excellent angelical kingdom, how comely dressed and adorned wert thou once! How hath the devil turned thee into a murderous den? Dost thou suppose thou standest now in the flower of thy beauty and glory? No, thou standest in the midst of hell. If thine eyes were opened, thou wouldst see it. Or dost thou think that the spirit is drunken and doth not see thee?" Boehme. There sits the Sphinx from age to age in that road. Charles says, and every wise man that comes by has a crack with her. But this ogre's plan and scope argue great boldness and manhood to depart thus widely from all routine and seek to put his hands, like Atlas, under nature and heave her from her rest. Why the world exists, and that it exists for a language or medium whereby God may speak to man, this is his query, this his answer. Saturday Eve. The distinction of fancy and I imagination seems to me a distinction in kind. The fancy aggregates, the imagination animates. The fancy takes the world as it stands and selects pleasing groups by apparent relations. The imagination is vision, regards the world as symbolical, and pierces the emblem for the real sense. Sees all external objects as types. A fine example is the account of the execution of Lord Russell. Anecdotes Spence, page 11. God hides the stars in a deluge of light. That is his chosen curtain. So he hides the great truths in the simplicity of common consciousness. I am struck with the contrast which I have repeatedly noted before between the positiveness with which we can speak of certain laws, and evidence equal to that of consciousness, and the depth of obscurity in which the person of God is hid. From month to month, from year to year, I come never nearer to definite speaking of him. He hideth himself. I cannot speak of him without faltering. I unsay as fast as I say my words. He is, for I am. Say rather, he is, but in the depth inaccessible of his being he refuses to be defined or personified. After 30, a man wakes up sad every morning, except perhaps 5 or 6 until the day of his death. It was strange, after supposing for years that my respected friend was the heart of the country and blended thoroughly with the people, to find him wholly isolated, more even than I, walking among them with these monumental manners, unable to get within gunshot of any neighbor except professionally. Yet the fullness of his respect for every man and his self-respect at the same time have their reward, and after sitting all these years on his plain wooden bench with eternal patience, honor comes and sits down by him. August 3rd. Charles wonders that I don't become sick at the stomach over my poor journal. Yet his obdurate habit callous even to contempt. I must scribble on, if I were only to say in confirmation of Ogre's doctrine that I believe I never take a step in thought when engaged in conversation without some material symbol of my proposition figuring itself incipiently at the same time. My sentence often ends in babble from a vain effort to represent that picture in words. How much has a figure and illustration availed every sect? As when the reabsorption of the soul into God has figured by a phial of water broken in the sea. This morn I would have said that a man sees in the gross of the acts of his life the domination of his instincts or genius over all other causes. His willfulness may determine the character of moments, but his will determines that of years. While I thus talked, I saw some crude symbols of the thought with the mind's eye, as it were a mass of grass or weeds in a stream, of which the spears or blades shot out from the mass in every direction, but were immediately curved round to float all in one direction, when presently the conversation changed to the subject of Thomas à Kempis's popularity, and how Aristotle and Plato come safely down, as if God brought them in his hand, though at no time are there more than 5 or 6 men who read them, and of the Natural Academy, by which the exact value of every book is determined, maugre all hindrance or furtherance. Then saw I, as I spoke, the old pail in the Summer Street kitchen, with potatoes swimming in it, some at the top, some in the midst, and some lying at the bottom. And I spoiled my fine thought by saying that books take their place according to their specific gravity, as surely as potatoes in a tub. It occurred with regard to a Kempis that it is pleasant to have a book come down to us of which the author has, like Homer, lost his individual distinctness, is almost a fabulous personage, so that the book seems to come rather out of the spirit of humanity, and to have the sanction of human nature, than to totter on the 2 legs of any poor ego. For language of nature, Ichabod Morton uses no other. Peter Hunt, Crockett, and the Vermont Drover. So in the 17th century it appeared in every book. And to put finger in the eye and to renew their repentance, they think this is weakness. Thus Shepherd, 1645, New England's Lamentation. I suspect that wit, humor, and jests admit a more accurate classification by the light of the distinction of the reason and the understanding. Nothing is so cheap as jests of the sort that fill Byron's heaven and earth. They might be manufactured by the thousand. All the dinner wit that assails Swedenborg and his church is cut off the same piece. Quote, "He shall be as a god to me," said Plato, "who can rightly define and divide." End quote. Who can make a good sentence can make a good book. Ex ungu leonum. If you find a good thing in the writing of a mediocre man, be sure he stole it. Edward Bagshaw wrote in 1662, quote, "An answer to all that Roger L'Estrange intends to write." End quote. We have little control of our thoughts. We are pensioners upon ideas. I wrote to Miss Peabody on Swedenborg that I should certainly not have denied awake that the spiritual contains the intellectual nature, or that the moral is prior in God's order to the intellectual, which I believe. The two attributes of wisdom and goodness always face and always approach each other. Each, when perfect, becomes the other. Yet to the moral nature belongs sovereignty, and so we have an instinctive faith that to it all things shall be added, that the moral nature being righted, the circulations of the universe take effect through the man as a member in its place, and so he learns the sciences after a natural or divine way. A good deed conspires with all nature, as the hands sing with a voice in the angels' concert. But there is a kind of falsehood in the enunciation of a chemical or astronomical law by an unprincipled savant. But whilst all considerate persons incline, I suppose, to this general confession, there still stand the uncontested facts that in our experience is almost no proportioned cultivation. The blacksmith has a strong arm, the dancer a strong foot. A great proficiency in the mathematics may coexist with extreme moral insensibility, and the splendors of holiness with a contempt for learning. Such lopsided, one-eyed half-men are we now, and such a yawning difference between our esse and our posse. I am content to find these differences. I am content to wait long before many refractory facts. A great tendency I like better than a small revelation, and I hate to be imprisoned in premature theories. I have no appetite, such as Sir Thomas Browne avows, for difficultous mysteries, that my faith may have exercise, but I had rather not understand in God's world than understand through and through in Bentham's and Spurzheim's. I like what you say of your aversion at being confined to Swedenborg's associations, and I confirm myself with similar declarations whenever my critical acumen, with which you make yourself so merry, is at fault in the great life. You have studied much the character of Jesus, and I read with pleasure every considered expression of praise of him. But perfect, in the sense of complete man, he seems not to me to be, but a very exclusive and partial development of the moral element, such as the great compensation that balances the universe provides to repair accumulated depravity. The weight of his ethical sentences deserves more than all the consideration they have, and his life is one original pure beam of truth. But a perfect man should exhibit all the traits of humanity, and should expressly recognize intellectual nature. Socrates I call a complete universal man, fulfilling all the conditions of man's existence. Sublime as he is, I compare him not as an ethical teacher to Christ, but his life is more humane. Ah, Homer, ah, Chaucer, ah, Shakespeare, but we live in the age of propriety. Their elegance is intrinsic, ours superadded. Their cleanness is sunshine, ours painting and gilded. Classification. A thought comes single, like a foreign traveler, but if you can find out its name, you shall find it related to a powerful and numerous family. August 5th. Our summer, Charles says, is a galloping consumption, and the hectic rises as the year approaches its end. Wordsworth's Ode to Duty singeth, "There are who ask not if thine eye be on them, who in love and truth, where no misgivings is, rely upon the genial sense of youth, glad hearts, without reproach or blot, who do thy work and know it not." Happy they and their counterparts in the intellectual kingdom, who sit down to write and lend themselves to the first thought, and are carried whithersoever it takes them, and solve the problem proposed in a way they could not have predicted, and are not now conscious of their own action. Merely they held the pen. The problem, whilst they pondered it, confounded them. The birds fly from us, and we do not understand their music. The squirrel, the musquash, the insect have no significance to our blind eyes. Such is now the discord betwixt man and nature. Yet it is strange that all our life is accompanied by dreams on one side, and by the animals on the other, as monuments of our ignorance, or hints to set us on the right road of inquiry. The life of a contemplator is that of a reporter. He has 3 or 4 books before him, and now writes in this, now in that other, what is incontinuously said by one or the other of his classes of thought. It is a good trait of the manners of the times that Thaddeus Blood told me this morning that he, then 20 years old, and Mr. Ball, 50, were set out to guard Lieutenant Potter, the British officer taken at Lexington, 19th April, 75, and whilst staying at Reuben Brown's, Potter invited them both to dine with them. He, Lieutenant Potter, asked a blessing, and after dinner asked Mr. Ball to dismiss the table, quote, which he did very well for an old farmer. Lieutenant Potter then poured out a glass of wine to each, and they left the table. Presently came by a company from Groton, and Lieutenant Potter was alarmed for his own safety. They bolted the doors, etc., etc. Bateman, he thinks, could not have made the deposition in Dr. R.'s history. A ball passed through his cap, and he cried, "A miss is as good as a mile." Immediately another ball struck his ear and passed out to the side of his mouth, knocking out 2 teeth. He lived about 3 weeks, and his wounds stunk intolerably. It was probably Carr's or Starr's deposition. The powers of the poetical genius seem quite local, and to give no felicity in any other work transcending the strait limits of that vein. Wordsworth writes the verses of a great original bard, but he writes ill, weakly concerning his poetry, talks ill of it, and even writes other poetry that is very poor. True love watched every word and gesture of her shepherd, and believed in her heart that things he did and thought not of were beautiful. Faint love talked of her affection, but cared only for those words and deeds of the swain that respected herself. What else, though it were more wise and good, she noted never. If you read much at a time, you have a better sight of the plan and connection of the book, but you have less lively attention. If you read little, fine things catch your eye, and you read accurately, but all proportion and ulterior purpose are at an end. Charles doubts whether all truth is not occasional, not designed to be stored for contemplation, but alive only in action. Make much of your own place. The stars and celestial awning that overhang our simple Concord walks and discourses are as brave as those that were visible to Coleridge as he talked, or Dryden or Ben Jonson and Shakespeare, or Chaucer and Petrarch and Boccaccio when they met. For the history of psalm singing in our churches, see Wharton, History of English Poetry, Volume 3, page 447. Hurrah when next it rains in the private sky for Miss Fanny Kemble's journal and Lyell's geology. The human mind seems a lens formed to concentrate the rays of the divine laws to a focus, which shall be to the personality of God. But that focus falls so far into the infinite that the form or person of God is not within the ken of the mind. Yet must that ever be the effort of a good mind, because the avowal of our sincere doubts leaves us in a less favorable mood for action, and the statement of our best thoughts, or those of our convictions that make most for theism, induces new courage and force. August 6th. I think I may undertake one of these days to write a chapter on literary ethics, or the duty and discipline of a scholar. The camel and his 4 stomachs shall be one of his emblems. In Dunbar of Saltown's Golden Targe, Walton, History of English Poetry, Volume 3, page 102. One of the dramatis personae is New Acquaintance, who, quote, embraces him a while, but soon takes her leave and is never seen afterwards, end quote. I suppose a reason why one man apprehends physical science better than another is that his fancy is stronger, so that he can comply with the prescribed conditions of the problem long enough for the full apprehension of the law. As in learning the precession of the equinoxes, he can keep the picture of the sun where he ought in his mind, and figure to himself the nutation of the axis of the earth, etc., etc. But I, alas, write my diagrams in water. In 1542, Robert Wyer printed the Schola House, in which the writer is thus merciless to women. His name is unknown. I fear it was a private revenge. Truly some men there be that live always in great horror, and say it goeth by destiny, to hang or wed both hath 1 hour. And whether it be, I am well sure, hanging is better of the twain, sooner done and shorter pain. Warton, History of English Poetry, Volume 3, page 426. August 8th. Yesterday I delighted myself with Michel de Montaigne. With all my heart I embrace the grand old Sloven. He pricks and stings the sense of virtue in me. The wild Gentile stock, I mean, for he has no grace. But his panegyric of Cato and of Socrates and his essay of cruelty, Volume 2, do wind up again for us the spent springs and make the virtue possible without the discipline of Christianity, or rather do shame her of her eye service and put her upon her honor. I read the essays in defense of Seneca and Plutarch on books, on drunkenness, and on cruelty, and at some fortunate line which I cannot now recall, the spirit of some Plutarch hero or sage touched mine with such thrill as the war trump makes in Talbot's ear and blood. I know no truer poetry in modern verse than Scott's line, quote, and sun himself in Ellen's eyes, end quote. Every fact studied by the understanding is not only solitary, but desert. But if the iron lids of reason's eye can be once raised, the fact is classified immediately and seen to be related to our nursery reading and our profoundest science. August 13th. Add to what was said August 6th concerning literary ethics, that no doubt another age will have such sermons duly preached, and immortality will be proved from the implication of the intellect. For who can read an analysis of the faculties by any acute psychologist like Coleridge without becoming aware that this is proper study for him, and that he must live ages to learn anything of so secular a science? August 14th. We would call up him who left hath told the story of Cambuscan bold. But the great contemporary just now laid in the dust no man remembers. No man asks for him who broke off in the first sentence the analysis of the imagination, on the warning of a friend that the public would read not the chapter. No man asks, where is the chapter? August 15th. I bought my house and 2 acres 6 rods of land of John T. Coolidge for $3,500. Here is an insertion by the editor about Emerson's living situation. Mr. J. T. Coolidge of Boston had the house built for his son about 1825. It faced on the Cambridge Turnpike just where it leaves the quote-unquote Great Road, where the stages pass to and from Boston. The main house was of an L shape, but Mr. Emerson soon had the square completed by a parlor behind his study, with a chamber above. The prolongation towards the flower garden and brook beyond was part of the original house and contained kitchen, servants' chambers, and woodshed. Although on low land in a river town, these disadvantages were met by the sandy soil and the mile-long southward slope of the opposite tableland, which gave the region a different climate in cold weather from the rest of Concord Plain, shutting off the north and storing sun heat by day to neutralize the night damp. The excellent cellar was always dry and light. Both Mr. and Mrs. Emerson had had threatenings in their lungs before they came there, but both lived well beyond 70. The trees did not overshadow the house, and the southeast yard and orchard and garden on the south were sunny and sheltered. The fire in 1872 only burned off the roof of the main house and put the top of the walls, though smoke and water did great damage below. The general appearance of the house when Mr. Emerson brought his wife thither was about as shown in the illustration made about 1852, except that some trees were smaller and others not yet planted. The study faced north and west, and its windows only show in perspective towards the right in the picture. In a letter telling his brothers of the purchase, Mr. Emerson said of the house, quote, "It was in a mean place and cannot be fine until trees and flowers give it a character of its own. But we shall crowd so many books and papers, and if possible wise friends into it, that it shall have as much wit as it can carry." End quote. August 25th. Visited Miss Harriet Martineau at Cambridge today. A pleasant, unpretending lady, whom it would be agreeable to talk with when not tired and at ease, but she is too wary of society to shine if ever she does. She betrayed by her facile admiration of books and friends her speedy limits. The ear trumpet acts as chain as well as medium in making Siamese of the two interlocutors. Henry Reeve, Henry Taylor of Manchester, John S. Mill, and W. J. Fox she regarded as the ablest young men in England. What pleased me most of her communications was that W. J. Fox, though of no nerve, timid as a woman, yet had the greatest moral courage. As Charles said at my commentary, quote, "Go and be hanged, but blush if spoken to on the tumbril." End quote. August 31st. Use of Harvard College to clear the head of much nonsense that gathers in the inferior colleges. It shall be a rule in my rhetoric, before you urge a duty, be sure it is one. Try patriotism, for example. Edward Taylor came to see us. Dr. Ripley showed him the battlefield. Quote, "Why put it on this bank?" End quote, he asked. Quote, "You must write on the monument. Here is the place where the Yankees made the British show the back seam of their stockings." End quote. He said he had been fishing at Groton, and the fishes were as snappish as the people, that he looked to see if the scales were not turned the wrong side, etc. September 14th. I was married to Lydia Jackson. October 2nd. The woods are all in a glow. Charles thinks never was great man quite destitute of imagination. Quote, "The fading virtues of later times were a cause of grief to his father Archidamus, who again had listened to the same regrets from his own venerable sire," end quote, said Agis, Plutarch, quote, "Apathogems," end quote, Lacon 17. Where is the ballad of Tamlane, from which the fine editor of Wharton borrows these lines? Quote, "Our shape and size we can convert to either large or small, and old nutshells the same to us as is the lofty hall." End quote. These lines, by the way, I would put into the mouth of the orators as parallel to Isocrates' account of eloquence. October 5th. I like that poetry which, without aiming to be allegorical, is so, which, sticking close to its subject, and that perhaps trivial, can yet be applied to the life of man and the government of God and be found to hold. Quote, "Little was King Lauren, but from many a precious gem his wondrous strength and power and his bold courage came. Tall at times his stature grew with spells of granary, then to the noblest princes fellow might he be." End quote. I take this to be a picture of a child of nature who draws his wisdom from the whole world and is great only when he has great argument, quoted by Edward Wharton from Little Garden of Roses. I see this moral in every novel, fable, mythology I read. I see it in all Plutarch and Homer and Aesop, in the Arabian Nights and Ravenswood, in Penseforest and Amadis. Quote, "Never much good comes of black bead eyes," end quote, Aunt Mary. Every man, if he lived long enough, would make all his books for himself. He would write his own universal history, natural history, book of religion, of economy, of taste. For in every man the facts under these topics are only so far efficient as they are arranged after the law of his being. But life forbids it, and therefore he uses Bossuet, Buffon, Westminster Catechism as better than nothing, at least as memoranda and badges to certify that he belongs to the universe, and not to his own house only, and contents himself with arranging some one department of life after his own way. Our will never gave the images in our minds the rank they now take there. Anecdotes I read under the bench in the Latin school assume a grandeur in the natural perspective of memory which the Roman history and Charles V, etc., have not. October 10th. This morning Mr. May and Mr. George Thompson breakfasted with me. I bade them defend their cause as a thing too sacred to be polluted with any personal feelings. They should adhere religiously to the fact and the principle, and exclude every adverb that went to color their mathematical statement. As Josiah Quincy said on the eve of revolution, "The time for declamation is now over. Here is something too serious for aught but simplest words and acts." So should they say. I said also what seems true, that if any man's opinion in the country was valuable to them, that opinion would be distinctly known. If Daniel Webster's or Dr. Channing's opinion is not frankly told, it is so much deduction from the moral value of that opinion, and I should say, moreover, that their opinion is known by the very concealment. One opinion seeks darkness. We know what opinion that is. The oak is magnificent from the acorn up. The whortleberry no pruning or training can magnify. Who can believe in the perfectibility of this race of man, or in the potency of education? Yet compare the English nation with the Eskimo tribe, and who can underestimate the advantages of culture? Charles thinks there is no Christianity, and has not been for some ages, and esteems Christianity the most wonderful thing in the history of the world. But for that he can arrange his theory well enough of the history of man. It is, according to him, the first exalting of the bestial nature, the first allaying of clay with the divine fire, which succeeds in a few cases, but in far the greater part the spirit is overlaid and expired. A few, however, under the benevolent aspect of heaven, so cooperate with God as to work off the slough of the beast, and give evidence of arriving within the precincts of heaven. But the introduction of Christianity seems to be departure from general laws and interposition. Jesus seems not to be man. Strange, thinks he, moreover, that so sensible a nation as the English should be content so long to maintain that old withered idolatry of their church, with the history too of its whole manufacture, piece by piece, all written out. Thompson, the abolitionist, is inconvertible. What you say, or what might be said, would make no impress on him. He belongs, I fear, to that great class of the vanity-stricken. An inordinate thirst for notice cannot be gratified until it has found in its gropings what is called a cause that men will bow to. Tying himself fast to that, the small man is then at liberty to consider all objections made to him as proofs of folly and the devil in the objector. And under that screen, if he gets a rotten egg or two, yet his name sounds through the world, and he is praised and praised. The minister should be to us as simple, absolute man. Any trick of his face that reminds us of his family is so much deduction, unless it should be chance that those related lineaments are associated in our mind with genius and virtue. But the minister in these days, how little he says, who is the most decorous man, and no longer who speaks the most truth. Look at the oration of Demosthenes and Burke, and how many irrelevant things, sentences, words, letters are there? Not one. Go into one of our cool churches and begin to count the words that might be spared, and in most places the entire sermon will go. One sentence kept another in countenance, but not one by its own weight could have justified the saying of it. 'Tis the age of parentheses. You might put all we say in brackets, and it would not be missed. Even blank has come to speak in stereotyped phrase, and scarcely originates one expression to a speech. I hope the time will come when phrases will be gazetted and no longer current, and it will be unpardonable to say, quote, "The times that tried men's souls," or anything about a cause, and so forth. Now, literature is nothing but a sum in the arithmetical rule, permutation, and combination. A man to thrive in literature must trust himself. The voice of society sometimes, and the writings of great geniuses always, are so noble and prolific that it seems justifiable to follow and imitate. But it is better to be an independent shoemaker than to be an actor and play a king. See the noble self-reliance of Ben Jonson. Shun manufacture or the introducing an artificial arrangement in your thoughts. It will surely crack and come to nothing. But let alone tinkering and wait for the natural arrangement of your treasures. That shall be chemical affinity, and is a new and permanent substance added to the world to be recognized as genuine by every knowing person at sight. A meek self-reliance I believe to be the law and constitution of good writing. A man is to treat the world like children who must hear and obey the spirit in which he speaks, but which is not his. If he thinks he is to sing to the tune of the times, is to be the decorous sayer of smooth things to lull the ear of society, and to speak of religion as the great traditional thing to be either mutely avoided or kept at a distance by civil bows, he may make a very good workman for the booksellers, but he must lay aside all hope to wield or so much as to touch the bright thunderbolts of truth, which it is given to the true scholar to launch, and whose light flashes through ages without diminution. He must believe that the world proceeds in order from principles. He must not guess, but observe without intermission, without end, and these puissant elements he shall not pry into who comes in fun, or in haste, or for show. The solemn powers of faith, of love, of fear, of custom, of conscience are no toys to be shoved aside, but the forces which make and change society. They must be seen and known. You might as well trifle with time. They keep on their eternal way, grinding all resistance to dust. If you will, you may read nothing but songbooks and fairy tales all the year round, but if you would know the literature of any cultivated nation, you must meet the majestic ideas of God, of justice, of freedom, of necessity, of war, and of intellectual beauty, as the subject and spirit of volumes and eras. What's a book? Everything or nothing. The eye that sees it is all. What is heaven's majestical roof fretted with golden fire to one man, but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapors? Well, a book is to a Paddy a fair page smutted over with black marks; to a boy, a goodly collection of words he can read; to half-wise men, it is lessons which he wholly accepts or wholly rejects. But a sage shall see in its secrets yet unrevealed, shall weigh as he reads the author's mind, shall see the predominance of ideas which the writer could not extricate himself from and oversee. The Belfast Town and County Almanac may be read by a sage, and, wasteful as it would be in me to read anti-Masonic or Jackson papers, yet whoso pierces through them to the deep idea they embody may well read them. October 13th. Do you see what we preserve of history? A few anecdotes of moral quality of some momentary act or word. The word of Canute on the seashore, the speech of the Druid to Edwin, the anecdote of Alfred's learning to read for Judith's gift, the box on the ear by the herdsman's wife, the tub of Diogenes, the gold of Croesus and Solon and Cyrus, the emerald of Polycrates, these things reckoned insignificant at the age of their occurrence, have floated, whilst laws and expeditions and books and kingdoms have sunk and are forgotten. So potent is this simple element of humanity or moral common sense. My will never gave the images in my mind the rank they now take there. The 4 college years and the 3 years' course of divinity have not yielded me so many grand facts as some idle books under the bench at the Latin school. We form no guess, at the time of receiving a thought, of its comparative value. Man idealizes every portrait. So are the sentiments of every age unconsciously corrected, and pure models upheld in the worst times. The canonizing of a good bishop or monk was a useful preaching to several ages. They who did it would naturally sink the faults and swell the virtues of their friend, and so give to virtuous youth an objective good. On party. The aliases of the father of William the Conqueror, who was called Robert the Magnificent, or Robert the Devil, are a good specimen of every man's Janus reputation. Genius can never supply the want of knowledge, though even its errors may be valuable. Madame de Staël tells me, in this fine book of the influence of literature, that the English do not admit much imagination into their prose, because, such is the facility of the structure of their blank verse, that every one reserves for poetry all such thoughts. What shall the English, of whom only 4 or 5 have ever succeeded in blank verse, say to this? Shakespeare, Milton, Young, Thomson, Cowper, Wordsworth. October 15th. It does seem, in reading the history of the writings of the English in the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, that their eyes were holden that they could not see. They submit to received views of religion and politics that a child would deride nowadays, and exhibit at the same time strong common sense in other things. What stuff there is even in Bacon! What a baby house he builds of diet and domestic rules, and Montaigne even. The right of civil liberty, how slowly it opens on the mind. Surely they say well who says that God screens men from premature ideas. A great bump of nonsense in Bacon and in Brown. Here follows a cert insertion from the editor. Mr. Emerson was preparing the course of 10 lectures on English literature, which he gave in November and December at the Masonic Temple in Boston, before the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. See Cabot's Memoir, Volume 2, Appendix F. When we enter upon the domain of law, we do indeed come out into light. To him who, by God's grace, has seen that by being a mere tunnel or pipe through which the divine will flows, he becomes great and becomes a man, the future wears an eternal smile, and the flight of time is no longer dreadful. I assure myself always of the needed help, and go to the grave undaunted because I go not to the grave. I am willing also to be as passive to the great forces I acknowledge as in the thermometer or the clock, and quite part with all will as superfluous. Do not expect to find the books of a country written as an encyclopedia by a society of savants, on system to supply certain wants and fill up a circle of subjects. In French literature, perhaps is something of this order of a garden, where plat corresponds to plat and shrub with shrub. But in the world of living genius, all that at first seems disorder, and incapable of methodical arrangement, yet is there a higher harmony, whereby 'tis set as in nature the sea balances the land, the mountain the valley, and woods and meadows, and as the eye possesses the faculty of rounding and integrating the most disagreeable parts into a pleasing whole. I listened yesterday, as always, to Dr. Ripley's prayer in the morning house, when tenfold the hope, a tenfold chance of some touch of nature that it should melt us, that I should have felt in the rising of one of the Boston preachers of proprieties, the fair house of Seam. These old semi-savages do, from the solitude in which they live, and their remoteness from artificial society, and their inevitable daily comparing man with beast, village with wilderness, their inevitable acquaintance with the outward nature of man, and with his strict dependence on sun and rain and wind and frost, wood, worm, cow, and bird get an education to the Homeric simplicity, which all the libraries of the reviews and the commentators in Boston do not countervail. What a Tantalus cup this life is! The beauty that shimmers on these yellow afternoons, who ever could clutch it? Go forth to find it, and it is gone. 'Tis only a mirage as you look from the windows of diligence. Charles says to read Carlyle in the North American Review is like seeing your brother in jail, and that Alexander Everett is the sheriff that puts him in. Far off, no doubt, is the perfectibility, so far off is to be ridiculous to all but a few. Yet wrote I once that, God keeping a private door to each soul, nothing transcends the bounds of reasonable expectation from a man. Now what imperfect tadpoles we are! An arm or a leg, an eye or an antenna is unfolded, all the rest is yet in the chrysalis. Who does not feel in him budding the powers of a persuasion, that by and by will be irresistible. Already how unequally unfolded in two men. Here is a man who can only say yes and no in a very slight variety of forms. But to render a reason, or to dissuade you by anything less coarse than interest, he cannot and attempts not. But Themistocles goes by and persuades you that he whom you saw up was down, and he whom you saw down was up. The ancients probably saw the moral significance of nature in the objects without afterthought or effort to separate the object and the expression. They felt no wrong in esteeming the mountain a purple picture whereon Oreads might appear as rightly as moss, and which was the image of stability, and whatever other meaning it yielded to the wandering eye, because they were prepared to look on it as children, and believed the gods built it and were not far off, and so every tree and flower and chip of stone had a religious luster, and might mean anything. But when science had gained and given the impression of the permanence, even eternity of nature, and of every substance, and when on the new views with this habit imparted to the learned wit wine derision arose, the mountain became a pile of stones acted on by bare blind laws of chemistry, and the poetic sense of things was driven to the vulgar, and an effort was made to recall the sense by the educated, and so it was fairly uttered by the poet and heard with a smile. The objective religion of the Middle and After Age is well exemplified in the spite which heightened Luther's piety. Quote, "We cannot vex the devil more," said Luther, "than when we teach, preach, sing, and speak of Jesus and his humanity. Therefore I like it well when, with loud voices and fine, long, and deliberately, we sing in the church, Et homo factus est, et verbum caro factum est. The devil cannot endure to hear these words. He flieth away," etc. Table Talk. October 20th. The hearing man is good. Unhappy is the speaking man. The alternations of speaking and hearing make our education. October 21st. Last Saturday night came hither Mr. Alcott, and spent the Sabbath with me. A wise man, simple, superior to display, and drops the best things as quietly as the least. Every man, he said, is a revelation, and ought to write his record, but few with a pen. His book is his school, in which he writes all his thoughts. The spiritual world should meet men everywhere, and so the government should teach. Our life flows out into our amusements. Need of a drama here. How well to lash the American follies. Every man is a system, an institution. Autobiography, the best book. He thinks Jesus a pure deist, and says all children are deists. Charles remarks upon the nimbleness and buoyancy which the conversation of a spiritualist awakens. The world begins to dislimn. It is the comfort I have in taking up those new poems of Wordsworth, that I am sure here to find thoughts in harmony with the great frame of nature, the placid aspect of the universe. I may find dullness and flatness, but I shall not find meanness and error. Whence these oaths that make so many words in English books? The sun, the moon, St. Paul, Jesus, and God are all called upon as witness that the speaker speaks truth. I suppose they refer to that conviction suggested by every object that something is, and signify if anything is, then I did so and so. Yet now they are all obsolete. Except for the court forms, I doubt if ever they would be used. They import something separate from the will of man. By day and night, by Jupiter, etc., by St. Nicholas, etc., i.e., my will, which interferes to color and change all things, interferes not here. This is. October 22nd. What can be truer than the popular poetic doctrine of a conjunction of stars? How many things must combine to make a good word or event? Most truly, Madame de Staël, that 'tis tradition more than invention that helps the poet to a good fable. What can be truer than the doctrine of inspiration, of fortunate hours? Things sail dim and great through my head. Veins of rich ore are in me, could I only get outlet and pipe to draw them out. How unattainable seem to me these wild pleasantries of Shakespeare, yet not less so seem to me passages in old letters of my own. What platitudes I find in Wordsworth. Quote, I, poet, bestow my verse on this and this and this. End quote. Scarce has he dropped the smallest piece of an egg which he fills the barnyard with his cackle. In the hours of clear vision, how slight a thing it is to die. It is so slight that one ought not turn a corner or accept the least disgrace, so much as skulking to avoid it. The mob may prove as kind and as easy a deliverer as a pin or a worm. The mob may seem a thing insignificant. It has no character. It is the emblem of unreason, mere muscular and nervous motion, no thought, no spark of spiritual life in it. It is a bad joke to call it a fruit of the love of liberty. It is permitted like earthquakes and freshets and locusts, and it is to be met like a blind mechanical force. What of these atrocious ancestors of Englishmen, the Briton, Saxon, Northman, Berserker? Is it not needful to make a strong nation that there should be strong wild will? If a man degenerates into goodness, he must find grafted again from the wild stock. We all know how life is made up. Trifles eat up the hours. How then is any acquisition, how is any great deed or wise and beautiful work possible? Let it enhance the praise of Milton, Shakespeare, and Laplace. These oppress and spitefully tyrannize over me because I am an idealist. The mob ought to be treated only with a contempt. Phocion, even Jesus, cannot otherwise regard it in so far as it is mob. It is mere beast of them that compose it. Their soul is absent from it. It is to consider it too much, to respect it too much, to speak of its terror any other way than a mere animal and mechanical agents. It has no will, oh no. Sunday, October 25th. Every intellectual acquisition is mainly prospective, and hence the scholar's assurance of eternity quite aloof from his moral convictions. Behind us, as we go, all things assume pleasing forms as clouds do far off. Even the corpse that has lain in our chambers has added a solemn ornament to the house. In this my new house no dead body was ever laid. It lacks so much sympathy with nature. Mr. Goodwin preached a good sermon this afternoon and said, "The Almighty never implanted in a human breast the right of doing wrong." As he taught, it seemed pleasant, the tie of principle that holds as brothers all men, so that when a stranger comes to me from the other side of the globe, Tahitian or Chinese, to buy or sell with me, he shall have that measure from me as shall fill his mind with pleasant convictions that he has dealt with a fellow man in the deepest and dearest sense. A talk in the morning concerning eyes and their spiritual and incorruptible testimony. When a man speaks the truth in the spirit of truth, God aids him by giving him an eye as clear as his own heavens. When you think of a friend's character, you think of his eye rather than of form or mouth. Weston's story of the boy that was cross-eyed whenever he lied, but the axes of the eyes parallel when he spoke truth. Quote, "In no man's path malignant stood." End quote. Excellent hymn of Cowper concerning truths which o'er the world rise but never set. End quote. The preacher thought I in church must assume that man is the revelation, and that if he will reflect, he shall find his heart overflowing with the divine light, and the Bible shall be a mirror giving back to him the refulgence of his own mind. Let the preacher speak himself in the same faith that we all, his hearers, are urns of the Godhead, and will surely know if any word of our own language is uttered to us, and will accept it, but that all of us which is divine must remain forever impassible to anything else. He, the preacher, let him then acquiesce in being nothing that he may move mountains. Let him be the mere tongue of us all. No individual, but a universal man. Let him leave his nation, his party, his sect, his town connection, even his vanity and self-love at home, and come hither to say what were equally fit at Paris, at Canton, and at Thebes. There is no wall like an idea. I used to remark Edward's Greek petulance disclosed in answers like that of Pyrrhus when invited to hear one mimic the nightingale, but I have heard the nightingale itself. MME has made many such speeches. A good one of this sort, the putting down reverend folly by childish reason, is Hannibal's answer to Antiochus, saying that, quote, "The entrails of the sacrifice forbade the battle," end quote. Quote, "You are for doing what the flesh of a beast, not what the reason of a wise man adviseth," end quote, Socrates also. Webster is in a galvanized state when he makes the Haynes speech, and 'tis as easy to say gigantic things, to introduce from God on the world, quote, "truths which rise but never set," end quote, as at another house to talk nonsense. He is caught up in the spirit and made to utter things not his own. October 28th. The Oriental man, Abraham and Heth, Job, etc., man stands on the point betwixt the inward spirit and the outward matter. He sees that one explains, translates, the other, that the world is the mirror of the soul. He is the priest and interpreter of nature thereby. 'Tis a good thing for man that I am obliged to pick my words of low trades with so much care. In England you may say a sweep, a blacksmith, a scavenger, as synonym for a savage in civil life. But in this country I must look about me. I perhaps speak to persons who occasionally or regularly work at these works, and yet do take, as they ought, their place as men in places of manly culture and entertainment. Wakic and Caliph, who died A.D. 845, ended his life with these words, quote, "O thou, whose kingdom never passes away, pity one whose dignity is so transient." End quote. Turner, Anglo-Saxons, Volume 1, page 286. October 30th. It will not do for Sharon Turner, or any man not of ideas, to make a system. Thus, Mr. Turner has got into his head the notion that the Mosaic history is a good natural history of the world, reconcilable with geology, etc. Very well, you see at once the length and breadth of what you may expect, and lose all appetite to read. But Coleridge sets out to idealize the actual, to make the epopeia out of English institutions, and it is replete with life. November 6th. Burke's imagery is, much of it, got from books, and so is the secondary formation. Webster's is all primary. Let a man make the woods and fields his books. Then at the hour of passion his thoughts will invest themselves spontaneously with natural imagery. Plutarchiana this morn. Verses and words served as hampers and baskets to convey the oracle's answers from place to place. Then was it that history alighted from versifying, as it were from riding in chariots, and on foot distinguished truth from fable. He speaks of the lovers of omens, etc., as preferring rainbows and halos to the sun and moon. Charles says the nap is worn off the world. Here's a short insertion from the editor. During November, Mr. Emerson accepted an invitation to preach in the church at Lexington East Village, and continued to do so, not hampered in his manner of conducting the service, for nearly 3 years. Quote, "To know that the sky is everywhere blue, you need not travel around the world." End quote. November 7th. Advantage of the spiritual man in the fact of the identity of human nature. Draw your robe ever so chastely around you. The surgeon sees every muscle, every hair, every bone, every gland. He reads you by your counterpart. So I read the history of all men in myself. Give me one single man, and uncover for me his pleasures and pains. Let me minutely and in timbers and ground plans study his architecture, and you may travel all round the world and visit the Chinese, the Malay, the Eskimo, and Arab. I travel faster than you. In my chimney corner I see more and anticipate all your wonders. Or do you ransack all the histories and learn what has been done and thought back in time, in the 16th century, in the Middle Age, at the time of the consuls, or in the twilight of history, and I, intent upon the principles of this one man, will know what you shall say, and will say that also which shall be made good ages hence in some far-stretching revolution. November 14th. Melancholy cleaves to the Saxon mind as closely as the tones of an Aeolian harp. When yesterday I read Antigone, at some words a very different image of female loveliness rose out of the clouds of the past and the actual. That poem is just what Winckelmann described the Greek beauty to be, quote, the tongue on the balance of expression, end quote. It is remarkable for nothing so much as the extreme temperance, the abstemiousness, which never offends by superfluous word or degree too much of emotion. How splendid the materials, how few the incidents, how just the symmetry. Charles thinks it is as great a work of genius as any, every word writ in steel. But that the other image which it awakened for me brought with it the perception how entirely each rational creature is dowried with all the gifts of God. The universe, nothing less, is totally given to each new being. But I thought thus yesterday in regard to the charming beauty which a few years ago shed on me its tender and immortal light. She needed not a historical name, nor earthly rank or wealth. She was complete in her own perfections. She took up all things into her, and in her single self sufficed the soul. The way in which Plutarch and the ancients usually quote the poets is quite remarkable, as it indicates a deep and universal reverence for poetry, indicates a faith in inspiration. They quote Pindar much as a pious Christian does David or Paul. Where is that reverence now? Fine walk this afternoon in the woods with Charles. Beautiful Gothic arches, yes, and cathedral windows, as of stained glass, form the interlaced branches against the gray and gold of the western sky. We came to a little pond in the bosom of the hills, with echoing shores. Charles thought much of the domesticity and comfort there is in living with one set of men, to wit, your contemporaries, and thought it would be misery to shift them, and hence the sadness of growing old. Now every newspaper has tidings of kinned folk. I projected the discomfort of our playing over again tonight the tragedy of Babes in the Wood. Charles rejoiced in the serenity of Saturday night. It was calm as the universe. I told him what a fool he was not to write the record of his thoughts. He said it was an impiety, yet he meant to when he was old. I told him, when Alcibiades turned author, we workies should be out of countenance. Yet I maintain that the Lycidas was a copy from the poet's mind printed out in the book, notwithstanding all the mechanical difficulties, as clear and wild as it had shone at first in the sky of his own thought. We came out again into the open world and saw the sunset as of a divine artist, and I asked if it were only brute light and aqueous vapor, and there was no intent in that celestial smile. Another topic of the talk was that lyceums, so that people will let you say what you think, are as good a pulpit as any other. But C thinks that it is only by an effort like a berserker a man can work himself up to any interest in any exertion. All active life seems an amabilis insania, and when he has done anything of importance, he repents of it, repents of virtue as soon as he is alone. Nor can he see any reason why the world should not burn up tonight. The play has been over some time. Peace and war, quote, the wounds inflicted by iron are to be healed by iron, and not by words, quote, said the elder Cancellieri, and ordered the hand of Lohr to be cut off. Mueller, Volume 3. Magnanimity of literary men, Argyropoulos and Theodore of Gaza. Mueller, Volume 3. In Elizabeth's time, the High Church was looked upon by intelligent men as, quote, a horse which was still kept always saddled in readiness for the Pope, see Mueller. Compensation. Charles V always dissembled and never was believed. December 7th. Last week Mr. Alcott spent 2 days here. The wise man who talks with you seems of no particular size, but, like the sun and moon, quite vague and indeterminate. His characterizing of people was very good. Hedge united strangely the old and the new. He had imagination, but his intellect seemed ever to contend with an arid temperament. George Bradford was an impersonation of sincerity, simplicity, and humility without servility. Carlyle's talent, I think, lies more in his beautiful criticism, in seizing the idea of the man or the time, than in original speculation. He seems to be most limited in this chapter or speculation in which they regard him as most original and profound. I mean, in his religion and immortality from the removal of time and space. He seems merely to work with a foreign thought, not to live in it himself. In Shakespeare, I actually shade my eyes as I read for the splendor of the thoughts. December 12th. I wrote to H. Ware, Jr. that his, quote, fourth topic, the circumstances which show a tendency toward war's abolition, seemed to me the nearest to mine, for I strongly feel the inhumanity or unmanlike character of war, and should gladly study the outward signs and exponents of that progress which has brought us to this feeling. End quote. The arts and sciences are the only cosmopolites. This is the end of Journal Collection number 26 of the Collected Journals of Ralph Waldo Emerson, dating from 1835. This is also the end of Volume 3. In the following video, we will proceed to Volume 4 and Journal Collection number 27, dating from 1836, when the poet is 33 years old. Thank you for listening.